Welcome. My name's Sarah Paxton. I'm the Community and Events Manager at Optimal Workshop. Thank you so much for taking your time to join us at another session of UX Insider. I'm happy to be welcomed with the amazing Sarah from Microsoft. And without further ado, I will kick off and let her start the presentation.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, my name is Sarah Barrett, and I currently work at Microsoft as a Director of Information Architecture. And so I'm going to start with a little story, and I'm curious if this resonates with any of you. So I'd been at Microsoft for a few months when my manager asked me what I thought we should do with our site's information architecture. It's a pretty big question for a couple of reasons. Partially because the platform I work on, Microsoft Learn, has somewhere between 40 and 50 content types, millions of individual documents, which are contributed by thousands of people, none of whom agree about anything, as far as I can tell. But also because, frustratingly for many people, I think the intellectually honest answer to most questions about information architecture is I'm not sure, or it depends. But I did have a basic idea of the strategic direction I wanted us to take. So I started to give my spiel about how I'd break down information architecture. The navigation model, which are the types of navigation you expect to have on the site. These might be persistent, where they show up on every page. They might be contextual, where they only show up in some places, some contexts. They might be utility nav, like your login or something like that. And then the rules for putting those together. Ironically, in all of my years as an information architect, I'm not sure I've ever made an actual sitemap. But in my experience, when people ask for a sitemap, this is what they want. They want to know how to put the navigation together. And sometimes this is what people mean when they say an information architecture. But there's also the content model, which are the reusable pieces of content the site is made up of and their relationships to each other. So if we're a recipe site, it's probably recipes, but it might also be chefs, ingredients, menus, maybe even blog posts and reviews or comments. Throughout this, I'm going to be talking about websites because that's most of what I'm working on right now. But I think all of this is also essential if you're trying to get content to publish wherever you want. What we used to call like omni-channel. So if you're doing digital signage or apps or APIs, you still need to figure out what stuff you have. And lastly, you have the information model, which is the infrastructure of taxonomies and metadata that string it all together and make it work. My pro tip, just from me to you, is if you want to get somebody to pay for this, don't call it taxonomies, call it a knowledge graph, even if it isn't one yet. It worked for us. That got it funded. So I was feeling pretty good about having this clear articulation of this complex space. And I was ready to launch into where I thought we needed to take the product strategy when he interrupted me and he clarified, no. Like, does it go across the top or down the side? And I realized in that moment, as I saw my career flash before my eyes, that if that was the decision he needed somebody to make, nobody knew what I was there to do except for me. My job wasn't going to be doing good IA, or it wasn't going to be just doing good IA. It was going to be figuring out how to be allowed to do good IA. And I see this in lots of areas where experts work with generalists. I'm talking about information architecture because it's what I do. It's what I'm the most familiar with. But I see it happening all the time in user research, SEO, content design, even design writ larger. As consultants or in smaller contexts, our job is often to do our specialty well. We get to focus on the what. And it makes sense. This is what they teach us in school. If you go to school for this kind of thing, it's what you learn in apprenticeships for the most part. And we think our job is asking questions like, what are the most impactful user research questions we could answer? What's the most effective navigation paradigm for this set of users, content, and business goals? What technical changes do we need to make to consistently rank in the top 5 for priority queries? In the enterprise, though, The what usually becomes straightforward because we're doing a bad job at the basics. As an IA, I've spent my career helping enterprises get to not terrible. And that's not because not terrible is good enough and is all we should ever hope for. It's because getting from terrible to not terrible is often organizationally much more challenging than getting from fine to pretty good, actually. It often requires entirely new approaches or ways of thinking about the organization in really basic ways. So you end up with a very basic what question. What would improve this site's IA? And I find the answer is often almost anything. It's really common. Navigation that's organized around something other than, well, Kevin's the merchandiser for both coolers and mountain bikes, so we're going to put those together. And I'm not kidding, this is a screenshot from an actual site that I worked on. It has a subcategory for bikes, seasickness, and sunscreen, which is great. And if you're laughing at this, as I also am, I guarantee that if you work in a big enough context, every one of us has something this messy in something we've worked in. This is the kind of thing that happens. This is what enterprise means to me. So you don't get to these kinds of what questions as often as you want to in an enterprise context because they're eclipsed by straightforward but difficult how questions. How does research get a seat at the table? How do I get anybody to loop IA in? How can I make anyone prioritize SEO? In short, how can I make anyone else care? And I find that this really easily becomes, how can I make anybody care about me and what I bring to this? And this how question is engaging because it's emotional. It gets at your sense of identity as a specialist and what you bring to an organization and why they would even continue paying to you. But I think it's also not helpful because mostly I'm not sure you can make anyone else care. I think it's the wrong question. I think we can ask a better question because at a certain level in certain kinds of organizations, the job is different than we thought it might be. When getting it done is harder than figuring out what to do, getting it done is the job. And at a certain point in your career, I think many of us are familiar with the idea that certain parts of our jobs are political or require us to do politics. And interestingly, I find that there's very little information aimed at people in our world about how you do that effectively. What does it mean to do politics well in our context? So I've looked deeply into how individuals make things happen in actual political contexts. And I think there are some accessible tools that we can steal. So I want to talk about this art of getting things done in the enterprise as a skill that can be developed and tools that can be used. I'm going to share one that I use with my team all the time and that I've used on myself a lot. So one useful tool, a thought exercise. I would like you to imagine that you have 15 minutes with your CEO or someone of equivalent power. Here's Microsoft's CEO, Satya Nadella. I tried to find a picture where it looks like he's listening. And you have 15 minutes with your CEO. If your idea is good and your evidence is strong, she'll pick up the phone and call anyone. What do you ask for? I'm giving you a second because I'm wondering if you have an immediate answer. I didn't the first time I thought about this. And I think it's because it's really hard, like deceptively so. And I think it's hard for two main reasons. First, it's easy to think of ourselves as powerless because we don't have the authority to directly make anything happen. Maybe we can make some things happen. We can't just make anything happen. So we need to do some work to develop a sense of agency over what we can make happen. And also, second, it's easy to keep our ideas in the abstract. I don't have neuroscience with me on this. I haven't looked it up, but I think there is something about human brains not liking to get concrete. We don't like to go from the abstract to the nitty-gritty of how exactly something happens. And the problem with that is that, sure, your brain doesn't like that, but neither does anybody else's, and they don't want to do it either. And these difficulties together lead to what I call the somebody should do something syndrome. This takes hold easily, where it's really tempting to just gesture vaguely at everything that's going on that is completely wrong and just want somebody to fix it. And sure, absolutely. But who? What should they do? We need to get concrete. And I have some things that can get us there. The first step is to just choose somewhere to start. This is really hard, especially as we have talked about that, what would fix this site's IA? Almost anything. We have to just pick somewhere to start because something will help. And there's a real temptation to stall here, especially because I find that people will ask you, is this really the most impactful thing we can do? Can we guarantee that this will have impact on whatever the big things we care about are when we're so far behind? And the intellectually honest answer is probably, I'm not sure, but you do have to start somewhere. Then identify what specifically needs to be your final step. Who makes the commit or presses the button or approves the purchase order? Then you work backwards from there. How do things get approved for them to do? How does work get on their backlog? What documents have to be written? Then you tie up the loose ends. What else needs to be defined, decided, or written down? The more of this you can do or outline other people to help you with, the more likely they are to help you. Remember, human brains don't like to get concrete. Everybody else also has a job. If you get concrete for them, you make it easy to help you, more of it will get done. So let's talk through a ridiculously simple problem. Microsoft Learn, which used to be called Microsoft Docs, this is the website I work on, is the platform where Microsoft has centralized all their technical documentation, learning, credentialing, all that kind of thing. When I started 7 years ago, this website was already huge and was used by nearly 100 million people a month. And we didn't actually have a persistent header on the website. If you start on the homepage, you can see at the top here, it has a Microsoft Docs header. But if you actually clicked into any of these different products, you would get to a totally different header that showed you like a .NET or an Azure or an Office header, and there was no way to get back. And so depending on how you navigated around, because nobody uses one single Microsoft product, mostly we're using them together, depending on how you navigate it around, you could actually have a different header every time you clicked from page to page. It's pretty weird. From an IA perspective, what could be better than this? Basically anything. Didn't really matter. Anything would be better than this mess. But the underlying problem wasn't that people didn't know that websites were supposed to have headers. That everybody kind of knows that. It's pretty standard at this point. But the underlying problem was that the larger organization wasn't aligned on whether this website really did exist from a user perspective, or whether it should be white labeled and made part of the product websites. So should the .NET documentation seem like it was part of this thing we had called Microsoft Docs, or should it just seem like it was part of the larger .NET marketing site and other things there? Nobody was really sure about that. And as a result, it changed with every click because that was a pretty easy thing to allow to happen. This is not some wickedly difficult IA problem. Anybody could come in and say like, hey, have you considered putting a header on the website? That's fine. Like, whether it was across the top or down the side didn't matter. That wasn't the hard part here. The what was simple and easy, but it had been this way for years, it predated me, and mostly nobody else was bothered. It didn't seem like a big problem. And oddly, in our case, this isn't the case everywhere else, but all of these different parts of the site actually even use the same backend systems. So these transitions weren't reflecting technical barriers where they were implemented in different CMSs or anything like that. They were reflecting organizational transitions. Each team who wrote documentation for their area had traditionally managed their own header and put whatever they wanted in it. And it wasn't really clear whether anybody owned that space from a product perspective. There wasn't a site-wide change management process to make big things like that happen. So I talked you through the header problem, but there were tons of others. That was not the only one. We also had no metadata, no structured content. Every single one of the millions of pages on this site is a markdown file in a folder in a GitHub repo that gets built on top of it. So no metadata. URLs are determined entirely by the folder structure of those GitHub repos. We have very convoluted content organization with tables of contents that are maintained by hand. The search tool doesn't actually understand special characters, so you can't search for C#. Microsoft doesn't have a definitive list of products and services we sell. Nobody actually knows what the list of products is. So like there are all kinds of places we could have started. But I decided the header was the place I was going to start. And it was fascinatingly difficult to think this small for me as an information architect. I think it took about a year of me grappling with this system and the people to understand what was going on and be like, no, 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 we're going to scope this down. We're not going to try to solve everything. We're just going to try to fix the header. It had the benefit of being very visible. It has UI on the screen that everyone could see immediately. And so we could tell when it changed, which is something that, structured content or something like that doesn't necessarily show the same benefits in the same way right away. I could do a demo to show it to anyone at any time. And I knew that also new things we were building were making it worse. We had, for instance, launched a training capability on the platform that could be about how you use Azure and SQL together. Well, what header do you put on any of that when it's about two different products? Nobody knows. And so we had situations where, again, those headers were flipping with every click, and it was very confusing for everybody involved. So then I figured out, what was the final step? I decided the final step was going to be an engineer merging a commit to live that would deploy a shared header across the whole site. It couldn't be individual content teams opting in because, again, there are thousands of people who all contribute to it. I was never going to get all of them on board. So it had to be an engineering-based solution. I knew that work got spec'd and prioritized for engineering by product managers. Product managers owned that paper. So I needed a PM to be on board. No PM had previously owned this space, but there was one that plausibly could. That's my guy there. His name was Joe. So I pitched him on this being an important problem. Then I figured if I wanted to change the header, we had to have something to change it to. So I needed a proposal and a mock-up that everybody could see. I also needed to be able to prove that it wouldn't hurt sales or other numbers that marketing cared about. So I needed to do some basic projections and then run an experiment. We were going to have to notify contributors and main stakeholders to the site. So I needed a write-up about what a weird experience we currently had, what we were going to do about it, and how we would make sure that it worked after we did it. So this approach was not what I thought my job as an IA was. I thought my job was defining what went in a header and saying it should exist, and then somebody else would kind of go off and make it happen. Deciding what went in the header, that's the only IA here, and that took about 6 minutes of the 2 years this took to do. And that can be really frustrating because that's not what I thought my job was. But for me, at least, I found that embracing this reality was really powerful because it unlocked a few things. First, it gets you thinking strategically. Strategy gets talked about as a lot of different things, and I find it specifically gets pulled out as a way to justify not advancing people or not promoting them, or they don't think strategically. And at its core, I think strategy is just having a concrete goal and an idea of the steps and resources necessary to get there. This is the antidote to the kind of organizational codependence that just tries to get people to care like you do. Nobody cares about information architecture. If they did, they'd be information architects, and they're not. They care about month-over-month Azure spend or regulatory compliance or making sure marketing campaigns land. And I don't care about any of that. So you can burn yourself out and break your heart trying to get people to care. I don't think they always need to. They don't need to have their hearts and minds on board every time. They might just need to add you to the agenda or create a work item or merge a commit. Next, we become experts in how our organizations work. It's essential to understand the mechanisms by which change actually happens, or more frequently, fails to happen, in the organization you're working with, whether you're in-house or consulting. Milan Gunter talks about this in his edgy framework and calls it dancing to enterprise rhythms. I call it A does B, so C, which I think proves that like some people have the soul of poets and I apparently have the soul of a mechanic. But I think most people don't actually know very much about how things happen in their organizations. So we need to figure it out. And I think it's important here that the goal is to get close enough to understand the detailed workings without getting so close that you lose your critical distance and your desire to change it. I can't tell you how many times I've had the conversation like, hey, this is wild. We shouldn't be doing it. It needs to change. And the answer is, well, here's how that happened. And I'll say, cool, it needs to change. Why something happened is great context, but it's not rationale for it continuing to be that way. That expertise gives us another superpower. We'll be able to recognize windows of opportunity for the changes we want to make. This is often used abstractly, but windows of opportunity, I think, are moments of alignment between three streams: a problem stream, the solution stream, and the political stream. These are the problems the organization is already well aware of. So these are well-established pain points. Maybe we know that publishing takes forever, or we know that there are too many live site incidents. There are also usually general solutions that people are interested in. Right now, everybody in the world, in my world at least, wants to ship something with AI. That's a solution that people are already bought into. Or maybe there are other paradigms, like one of ours was treating docs as if they were code and managing on GitHub. That was a solution that had buy-in. I didn't have to sell anybody on that. And then there's the political landscape. What is everybody worried about internally right then? We just had layoffs, and everybody's worried about covering the amounts of work we have. There might be other things going on for you. Where those three things align is where you have a window of opportunity to make change. I think this framework is really powerful for things like information architecture or user research or a lot of kind of foundational design disciplines, because any IA change you make will plausibly address lots of different problems and leverage a few different solutions potentially and assuage many political worries. We've been through in my org, we've been through security being the most important thing, to extensibility being the most important thing, to content quality being the most important thing. And now AI is the most important thing, like over the past 2 years. And I think every single one of them can honestly be used as evidence for needing better information architecture. It's really easy to see any kind of upheaval as a threat to your program, as a threat to what you're trying to make happen. But I think if you're consciously considering these different streams, you'll notice how a crisis can also nudge them into alignment and give you an opening. In other words, I want you to never waste another crisis again. Lastly, if we work through this approach, I think you'll probably realize that we don't need the CEO after all. This exercise usually challenges me to think bigger because it makes me realize how small the blockers really are. Like, what am I going to do? I'm going to call Satya and ask him to make somebody like my header idea? I, I don't need that. I can do that closer to home. Also, when you think through it, people in positions of executive authority have a lot of power, but it's often limited in its ability to actually make things happen. No amount of executive authority is enough to make a wide-ranging agenda move forward. They still also have to think this way, and the people who are the most successful are very good at it. So we probably don't need the CEO. There's much greater chance that we need the person who owns the backlog or makes the agendas or controls the budget. And that person will just talk to us. After I'd been thinking about this for a while and kind of reflecting on how it was all working, We were working some of these ideas on my team. I mentioned this to a good friend of mine. She's not in UX remotely, but her family is in politics. And she was like, oh, yeah, that's how my grandfather got Sesame Street its first funding. He got us to practice pitching the president at Thanksgiving dinner. And I was like, great, awesome. This is not new. I did not come up with this, but I think it is really powerful. And if this approach can get Big Bird on the air and the first presidential debates televised and communication satellites launched and climate accords ratified, it can also get a header on one dumb website. To grossly misuse one of Mr. Minnow's turns of phrase, I can think of easier ways to make a living. This is not required of any of us, but it is very satisfying to get things done sometimes. Enterprise scale is what makes it hard, but it's also what makes it satisfying. We have the potential to affect people at a huge scale when we can make these things happen. So in my case, I figured out that Joe, that PM colleague of mine, could plausibly own the header as part of the product. And when I pitched it, him on it, he said, I agree, it's the right thing to do. Nobody will ever do it, not in a million years. And I said, okay, don't worry about it, don't worry about it. Just get a work item in the backlog and like get engineering to estimate it, because I wasn't quite sure how that happened yet. Just like get that for the technical change, and I would help make the case. And about a year later, while I was actually out on maternity leave, he flipped the switch and we got that single header. I'm particularly proud that this shipped when I was on leave, because it meant that it didn't stall or fall apart as soon as I wasn't babysitting it. It wasn't my thing anymore. It was a thing that we were just doing. And this is not a great header, like, to be clear. I think most of you could still go to Microsoft Learn and be like, wait, they have an IA, much less an IA team. And like, yes, I know, I'm on the internet also. We got it to not terrible or less terrible. But more importantly, the way of thinking that I'm talking about here meant that there was a path to make it better. Somebody owned the code, we owned the content, and we no longer had to make the case that a header should exist. This new one, that I think is actually pretty okay, shipped a while ago. After really nailing the how and the organizational change needed to get there, we actually got to do a little IA. And I think we did a good job. On subsequent projects, we're getting to do a lot of really interesting IA that's leading to things that I think are actively good and innovative, not just not terrible. But it took a lot of working the org to get there. In simpler business contexts, maybe at less senior levels, you get to just do good work, and that's enough. When you progress, though, it's pretty rare. It's pretty rare that nobody knows what would make things better. It's that nobody knows how to make it happen. That's a valuable gap to fill. And we need lots of tools in our toolbox, like a simple thought exercise to help you get something transformative shipped. So one more time, just a question to think on. If you had 15 minutes to pitch your CEO on something, what would you ask for? And then maybe a more challenging one. Are you working on it right now? I can't wait to hear what you do. Thank you.
Awesome, Sarah. Thank you so much for sharing.
My pleasure.
I'll give it a few minutes to see if anyone has any questions. Please feel free to raise your hand and or type it in the chat. You mentioned, first, it was really comforting to hear that Microsoft has some of the same issues that kind of almost every company has, being so big and
worse. No, I mean, everybody's bad, but you know.
But
Sorry.
it's reaffirming. Like we think of these large companies as having unlimited resources and all of these things, and it's comforting to know that everyone's kind of in the same boat, and we're all trying to pick and choose what projects we can have financing for, and which projects are make it to the top of the priority list, and what kind of has to slip down the backlog. And so it is comforting to know that it's a universal issue.
I was a consultant before I started at Microsoft, and it was a really valuable education in lots of ways, but partially because I never went into a big, Fortune 500 company and was like, this is great. They're doing everything exactly as I hope. I'm glad they're in charge. Like, everything's just managed by people, and it's hard and everyone's doing their best. And like with enterprise resources, you also end up with enterprise problems. And so I think it kind of evens out overall. I don't think Microsoft is notably worse than anywhere else, but they definitely don't have it all figured out.
Yeah. And then you kind of mentioned how everyone's kind of looking to AI a little bit, right? That might be the kind of problem solver for a few things. Have
Mhm.
you have you noticed an uptick in that, or what's kind of your thoughts on how some of that stuff might be implemented?
Yes, AI is 100% the thing
Yeah.
for my org right now. This has been the case for maybe about 2 years-ish, where it's like, what are you shipping with AI by March? Make it happen. And it's definitely part of every conversation we're having going forward. Um, it's been really satisfying because I'm not the biggest AI booster. I think it's potentially interesting, but like I'm not super convinced yet. That's also just kind of me. Um, but lately, when we've been doing product strategy for the platform, it's been really interesting how much of the stuff that people want to be able to do also requires this very basic stuff that was required for having a header on the site, all of these other things. And so I'm feeling very proud, among other things, that like we started laying this foundation, hired some really good people like 5 years ago. And it's very funny. I noticed a couple of people who like helped lay that foundation are actually on the call. People joined because they were interested. So you guys have to call out if I represented it unfairly. But like it was a lot of people trying to be like, wait, what are we doing here? And that's setting us up in a better position to be able to do some transformative things now.
That's fantastic. Ah, I think one of your colleagues said you nailed it.
Thank you, Marsh.
We have had a question pop up. You can see it in the chat.
Yeah. This was a quick one from Donna. Was this a book? Milan Gunter has a framework that he calls the EDGY framework, which is I can type his name in chat because my German, but which is about breaking down how organizations work so you can understand how to affect change within them. So I'll put that in chat. And then how to go about the idea of a super app where there are multiple products working in parallel and product managers trying to get numbers better of each one of them. How to make this whole landscape easier for the user and experience point of view. So if I'm understanding correctly, and feel free to, if you want to, come off mute and correct me. This sounds like a great example of a thing where, or a situation where you have a large interconnected system and everybody involved is optimizing for like local maxima where everybody's trying to get their numbers over here to go up and everybody's trying to get their numbers in another place to go up, which is a very human thing to do. Like I think it's a very human thing. Like, wait, there's a line. I'm going to make it go up. Like we're gonna make that happen. And so that's kind of the double-edged sword of giving people things like KPIs, which is that if you do implement that very KPI driven culture, which can be great in a lot of ways, like Christina Woodkey has written about this a lot. But like if you do that, then people will optimize for those numbers. And you have to make sure that like the numbers are continuing to do what you want. Um, I find systems thinking is your best friend here, specifically if you can figure out how to model the interactions between those pieces and the outcomes that are emerging from them. So the top metrics that you look for in the eye of a super app. There should be something that I'm not familiar with the concept of a super app. I assume it's just like a big app. But there should be things that it is supposed to do. And like that should be some kind of emergent property of all of this, with the idea that like, to use my context as an example, there's no individual interaction or product or feature that's going to make somebody a lifetime Microsoft customer. Realistically, that's something that emerges from the interaction of all of the different stuff we have in our ecosystem and how it all works together. And like, I'm coming with this example off the top of my head, so like maybe it's not perfect, but that's something that should kind of emerge from all of it. And so you need to figure out like what are the emergent properties of this big system that's the reason you're doing all of it. Like what is the reason you're not just turning it all off tomorrow? There's some reason why it should continue to exist. And then you can kind of go down a level and be like, okay, what are the interactions that are happening here? And what are the what are the forces that are working on them in places where they're either working against each other or they're creating like runaway feedback loops or something like that. I find like Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems, and then also Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline are really good tools for thinking about this kind of thing. But for me, like the short answer is like, what are the top metrics for the IA of an app are the business metrics. Because like that's what we're here to do. We're trying to get people to buy something or not leave or not contact support or whatever the thing is that we're trying to do. And that's what we're looking at the IA for also.
Wonderful. I'll give you a moment to type that name into the chat so
Yes,
people
thank
have an
you.
opportunity to do a bit more digging into it. I tried to Google it and I don't think my German spelling is accurate either. There we go.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Probably with that, if no other questions kind of pop up, we'll probably wrap up here and give everyone back a few minutes in their day. Final call for
Okay.
questions. Okay. Thank you so much, as it's echoed in the chat. Wonderful presentation. Thank you for taking the time and sharing with us today. We
Thanks,
really
everybody.
awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Bye bye.
Have a good bye.